Welcome to the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs, and when we're recording this, would have been the 100th birthday of Mr. Robert William Barker. And he hosted 3 game shows, but 2 of them lasted about 20 years at least. The Price is Right was what most people remember, but a lot of people may not remember Truth or Consequences, which he did for 19 years. And it's an honor to be talking with somebody who worked with Bob on Truth or Consequences, and that is game show creator, writer, and pun master Mark Maxwell-Smith. Thanks for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Josh. I appreciate being able to talk about Bob, and I certainly appreciate being able to talk with you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. We've gotten to talk about Jack Barry before, and it's an honor to be talking about Jack's good friend Bob Barker, as Jack used to oftentimes say on Joker's Wild. Tell us about yourself growing up, and how often did you watch Bob Barker on Truth or Consequences?
I watched him very often. He was, when I was a kid, I think one of those icons. I'm not going to say he was the very top star in the galaxy, but certainly that was Bob Barker, you know? So that when 20 years later, or less than 20, I got to work on the same stage, be in the same studio, be just in the same room with this man, what a treat that was.
Oh, definitely. And you grew up in New York City, so Bob was always on the West Coast, which is kind of hard to believe because most game show hosts got their start in New York and then eventually went to Tinseltown. But Bob was always in L.A. Did you ever get to travel to Los Angeles to attend a taping of the show?
I never saw anything in Los Angeles until I got in my car in 1969 and drove across the country in about half the time I thought I would, because after a while, the great planes were no longer great, they were just plain. So I moved quickly, got to Los Angeles, and I think it was actually late September, early October of 1969. Did not get a job right away working with Truth or Consequences. It took about a month before a fellow named Jerry Bender offered me a job in the prize company, which was a wonderful opportunity because for 2.5 years, I got to watch. I went to school. I went to the University of Barker and watched what these people did, but there was no pressure on me because I was just the kid, albeit sometimes the loud kid, the loud, large kid, who signed up the contestants and timed the prize plugs. But at the same time, by osmosis, by association, I got a sense of what it took to make an idea, and ultimately to watch Bob Barker do his masterful stuff. And I want to state clearly right now, I know you have the list of questions, or I assume you do, because I know you're always thorough, but here's the deal. If all you ever saw was Barker do The Price is Right, you only have about 30%, maybe 35% of what this man could do and did do in his career. Because on Truth or Consequences, and you can decide how much of that show's format you want me to explain. Mm-hmm. But on Truth or Consequences, he took what was sometimes paper mache and made it into a 100-story skyscraper. He built from nothing, and he had this amazing instinct for picking exactly the right contestant for a particular stunt or act or consequence that we would do.
Yeah, do describe the entire format because it was a fascinating show. Unfortunately, most of the episodes are no longer around, but the ones that are there are just entertaining to watch and makes me want to, where's more of them?
Well, I will tell you, first of all, it was Ralph Edwards who in 1940 or 41, I can't remember for sure, on radio sold an idea when he was all of 27, I think, years old. And the basic premise was, let's get people to do silly things. Let's play jokes on them sometimes. Let's dress them up funny. But the raison d'etre, which is a silly phrase to use for a show as silly as this was, the premise was that you'd come on the show as a contestant. If you didn't tell the truth, you'd have to pay the consequences, much like the game Truth or Dare. The difference here was the questions were always not about oneself. The questions were puns. They were jokes. One classic one that Ralph would cite was, if you have 2 glasses filled with water and a third one that's empty, what king does that suggest? And the answer is Philip the Third, or Philip the Third. Now, I won't take credit for that. But so if the contestant didn't answer the question correctly, and the hope was they never would, and you'd hear Beulah the buzzer, then Ralph on radio and a few other people before they got to Bob on television would then say, well, you didn't tell the truth. Now it's time to pay the consequence. And most often there was a joke or a trick somehow involved, but sometimes it was just having people do funny things, all about which they knew, because if it was always a joke, it was always a trick, if there was always some other gimmick, then the contestant would know, okay, when is that shoe going to drop? So every once in a while, at least in the television version, we might do a thing like Name That Lousy Tune, where we collected a whole bunch of people who thought they could play musical instruments and assembled an orchestra, and 3 contestants were playing Name That Tune, but the thing was, it was people who hadn't picked up a clarinet or an accordion since the 5th grade. So you can imagine what that sounded like.
Is that what inspired the Gong Show?
Well, I don't think it did, but at the time when I brought it in, and I'm quoting myself not because I think I'm some great artist, but because it's easiest to remember one's own children, I suppose. At the time, Ralph Everett's Productions was also producing Name That Tune, so it was a wonderful tie-in to do a little cross-pollination there. But many of the so-called consequences did involve a joke, and sometimes they involved reunions. Many of the reunions that you see on television today really had their start with Ralph and then later on with Barker, where someone would be surprised by the arrival of one's spouse or loved one or parent or child. And then there were the straight-out jokes. So a guy who fancied himself a dapper and quick dresser for whatever reason would be brought on with another fellow, and they were going to rush to their bunk beds and see if they could change their clothes quickly. And what the victim of the joke didn't know was that the guy running to the top bunk was a twin, and every time that fellow ran to the top bunk, we just lowered his twin brother, who'd already been dressed in the new outfit. If that kind of gives you a sense of a joke. Many of the jokes were based on fear, and I will also say based on gender stereotypes. I'm not bragging about that. I'm saying it's the truth. So a guy would be told, we're going to blindfold him and see if he can judge who kisses the best, a blonde, a brunette, or a redhead. And what the guy didn't know was each time it was his wife kissing him, and he's rating the kisses, right? So I think that kind of sums up the stuff that we did. But there's Barker given an idea. He goes out in the audience just before we tape, finds the people whom he thinks are going to fit best into an act, unless it's a set-up act, such as a reunion, where obviously you'd have to know in advance that this woman working in a factory is going to be surprised by her Marine husband who flew in from Okinawa or maybe just Nashville. So there was Barker, who A, had to pick somebody from the house, right? That's A. B, I had a career, or a component of my career, I shouldn't say it was a career. Component of my career was oftentimes interviewing contestants on other game shows and then writing, in quotes, ad-libs for the host, so that if the woman said her husband was a football player and Jack Barry said, what position did he play? And she said, he's a split end, he would be able to say, did he get that way because he shampooed too much? Okay. So, but Barker didn't have that either. There was no pre-interview, as many game shows, as you know, many game shows have. He was interviewing somebody on the fly and would always know somehow, instinctively, what question to ask. And I remember being in the studio one day, some delightful little lady, and I say lady because that's how we would have said it back then.
Yeah.
He said, well, what do you do when you're not working? She said, well, I go to church, but I go to church on the radio. I listen on the radio. And Barker just knew to say, well, why on the radio? And the woman said, because they don't take up a collection. And so he would just know how to put the ball on the tee for the contestant suddenly to become the star.
Yeah.
And he did it brilliantly for, as you said, decades, really, or almost a couple of decades, right?
That's right. And I remember the game show Congress back in 2004 when they named the Ralph Edwards Community Service Award as well as the Bill Cullen Lifetime Achievement Award. Bob Barker spoke on Ralph Edwards' behalf and told the awesome story about how he became the host of the show.
Right.
In 1956, NBC decided to bring it back 2 years after having canceled it. But they wanted Jack Bailey, who was already hosting Queen for a Day and very successful with that. And Bailey said, no, I'm not going to give up a show that's successful for something that got canceled. So Ralph Edwards did a series of auditions in both L.A. and New York. Couldn't find anybody that he liked. Nobody stood out. So one day he was listening to the radio in L.A. and he heard Bob on the radio. And he's like, this guy's really good, this audience participation show. But the radio station was a small signal, and so he lost track of where it was. And for a week he was like scrambling, trying, where's this Bob guy I really liked? And finally found him. It was 1230 KGFJ, which was like a Class A signal, which didn't reach all of the LA basin. It's now gone. It was such a bad signal. But then Bob said he got home and Dorothy Jo said, by the way, Bob, Ralph Edwards called, and he said, the Ralph Edwards? She said, yeah, the Ralph Edwards. He wants you to audition. And then I remember Bob said, Ralph did the audition. He said, you're my new host. And so NBC went to Ralph Edwards and said, do we have a new host? He said, yeah. And they're like, great, who? And he said, Bob Barker. And they said, who? Bob Barker. No, we don't want some no name. We want a well-known name. And so Edwards just went back and forth for several weeks trying to convince them. They said, okay, look, we'll let Bob Barker host it. However, you have to be the first person to come on in the first episode to introduce him. And he said, okay. And so that was the trick. And it was a hit on NBC for 9 years, 1 year off, and another 9 years in syndication. And so, wow, just, and Bob Barker said, if that had not happened, maybe I would have success, but maybe not.
And I want to not in any way correct, but amend or just
cool.
Elucidate a little bit. Number one, these words I heard directly out of Ralph's mouth, which was that he heard Bob on the radio, and on the radio he was exactly what Ralph thought he needed, facile, and I won't say glib because that implies that there was no sincerity, but he was able just to move things along quickly. But it was radio, and Ralph expressed his concern that he didn't know what this guy would look like. And while maybe today the requisites are a little bit different, at that point you wanted somebody who looked good as well as sounded good. And it wasn't until Ralph showed up at the office, or rather, Bob showed up at the office, that Ralph got to meet him and just was gobsmacked by what he saw, in addition to what Bob could do. And I will say, no matter how self-effacing Bob might have been, there's no doubt in my mind that eventually, somehow, he would have had a career. And it might have been a different career. It might have been not as swift or whatever, but certainly the man had so many skills that it would have been impossible to keep that under a blanket for too long.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And, I remember I was thinking about that. I got to interview Dan Ruppel, who was the supervising producer for The Price is Right from 1990 to 2000 a couple months ago. And just, Bob's kindness and just, he was on the air who he was off the air. And, you don't oftentimes, there's a lot of times you hear that's quite the opposite with people, but it was great to hear about Bob. And so I'm really glad to be talking to you about him today.
Well, the truth is, I have stated this many times in many places. Many times is maybe an overblown statement. But if I'm asked about Bob, I totally owe Jack Barry, with whom you and I have spoken. We've spoken about Jack before. Jack Barry and Bob Barker, both, each in his own way, gave me a tremendous boost in terms of my limited success in this industry. Both of them gave me a tremendous start and invested faith in my ability in different times, different ways. In fact, a mutual friend, Mark, or I think you know of Mark Summers. Mark
Yes.
Came to me one day. We were at CBS, and he said, I was just in the commissary, which was tiny. The CBS commissary at TV City was really small, so it was not all that difficult to overhear other people talking. He said, I just came out of the commissary, and Jack Barry and Bob Barker were in there sitting at his table together, and they were arguing over which one of them gave you your first opportunity. And I thought, my gosh, if those two guys are having that conversation, I guess things are okay. I may not be the guy who's hitting grand slams, but at least I'm getting to wear the uniform. And that was one thing that just added a great sense of joy for me. And it was true that Bob went to bat for me because, unfortunately, amazingly talented man named Bobby Lauer. Everybody, Lauer, Lauer. Go look up IMDb or Google him or Wikipedia, whatever you want. Bobby Lauer, brilliantly talented guy, was, when I got The Truth of Consequences, he was one of the three writers. Milt Larson, Jerry Payne, Bobby Lauer, the three of them had been there. I think when I got there, they had been there for 17 years, each of them. And Bobby, unfortunately, at the age of, I think, 42, had a massive heart attack, and what could have been a continuing career, it was cut short. A wonderful life was cut short, and it was that opening that allowed me to see if I could perhaps be a part of that family from the inside, as opposed to just being on the outside and doing the prizes. And Bob is the one who went to bat for me because, forgive me, he recognized that my particular skill set was one that they could use on the show. So
that's great.
I owe him a whole bunch of gratitude. And then, you know, he as demanding as he could be, and he was, and that's to say it was his face in front of the camera if an act failed, right?
Yeah.
It was what everyone is, most people, not most, many people who watch television game shows, if it's a quiz show, they think the host is making up the questions as you go along. So if people came out on stage, I think some people thought Barker was just making up the act as it went along too. And therefore, if it bombed, he was the one with an omelet dripping down his face. So he wanted to make sure that everything worked, or at least ensure that we could do the best job that we did. But I remember this is how he was a perfectionist. I came in with a silly idea once that was nothing more than a husband and wife were picked out of the audience. They were separated. We put the husband in an outfit so he wouldn't get his clothes dirty. And then we brought out the wife, and we opened up the curtains, and Tony Sabatino, our brilliant art director, had built the largest kind of gizmo, zibby-whirly machine you ever saw, with knobs and switches and dials. It was every kid's fantasy of that machine you wished you had at home that did nothing. And coming out of it, though, was a conveyor belt. And on the end of the conveyor belt, the other end was the husband lying down, and on the conveyor belt was a pie. And Bob said to the woman, and this is based on something that actually happened in our house. Bob said to the woman, in a moment I'm going to start the conveyor belt, and that pie is going to start creeping towards your husband, and all you have to do is stop the machine, which will stop the conveyor belt, which will stop the pie, and if you stop it in time, you win this prize. Tell him about it. Tell her about it, Charlie Lyon. And he plugged whatever major appliance it was. Well, the whole gimmick was that after Barker turned on the one switch, which didn't turn off, there was a very, what we thought was large enough, plug, like you'd plug into the wall. So if she yanked the plug, it would turn off the machine. And that happened once in our house, where the only way I could stop the clothes washer, which was off kilter, was I pulled the plug, right? Well, we went into rehearsal, and Barker looked at the machine, and he complimented Tony on the machine, and then he said, you have to make that plug 3 times as big. Because if it's not obvious, then it's not funny. And I know that's a small point, but that's how he was thinking. And all of us thought, it's fine, right? It was a regular-sized plug. No, he wanted one of those giant things that maybe a UNIVAC computer was plugged into or something like that. And that was his knowing where the funny would be. Mm-hmm. And that's a small example, but it's the only one I can think of at this moment.
This is the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs. We're talking with Mark Maxwell-Smith, who was a writer on Truth or Consequences, which was Bob Barker's very first game show. As we remember Robert William Barker on what would have been his 100th birthday. By the way, if you want to check out our Instagram, just go to JoshDJ57. That's JoshDJ57. Also subscribe here to our YouTube channel. And next time, Mark tells us how much input Bob had in the questions as well as the direction of the show.